months, we've been digging into the murder case against Sandra Melgar.
In other news, this week marks 10 years since a husband was found stabbed to death in his home. His name was Jaime Melgar.
Convicted of killing her husband and then staging a home invasion, is denied her appeal today.
Jim woke up on the morning of December 22nd with the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed he had already lived through the hardest parts of life, and that what remained would be peaceful, predictable, and shared with the person he trusted most, unaware that before the next sunrise, everything he had built would collapse into a mystery that no one would ever fully agree on. His name was Jim Melgar. He was 52 years old, living in Houston in a calm suburban neighborhood where nothing much ever seemed to happen. The kind of place where neighbors waved from driveways, where routines rarely changed, and where danger felt like something that happened somewhere else, on the news, not on your street. Jim was not the kind of man who demanded attention. He didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room or the center of every conversation. But people remembered him. They remembered his humor, the kind that leaned into bad jokes and goofy timing, the kind that made people groan and laugh at the same time. According to those who knew him, Jim had a warmth that felt steady and dependable. He was someone you could count on, someone who showed up. He had been born in Guatemala but moved to the United States when he was just 3 years old. His family settled in Houston, and that city became his entire world. The place where he grew up, built his career, and eventually met the person who would shape the rest of his life. That person was Sandra. Their story didn't begin dramatically. There was no grand cinematic moment. Instead, it started in a way that felt almost ordinary. In school, where Jim noticed Sandra and decided in his own persistent and slightly awkward way that he was going to ask her out. Over and over again, he asked. And for weeks, she said no. But Jim didn't give up. Eventually, Sandra agreed to go ice skating with him. It was a simple date, nothing extravagant, but it was enough. From that moment forward, their lives became intertwined in a way that lasted decades. They married in 1980. 32 years is a long time to share a life with someone. Long enough to grow up together, to build routines, to weather struggles, to create a shared language that only the two of you fully understand. Friends and family describe their relationship as close, not perfect, but deeply bonded. They weren't the kind of couple constantly displaying affection in grand ways, but there was something quieter there: familiarity, partnership. Together, they had one daughter, Elizabeth, known to everyone as Liz. Liz grew up in a household where her parents were not just partners, but best friends. She would later describe them as inseparable in many ways. The kind of parents who didn't just raise her, but included her in their world. The three of them formed a tight unit, traveling together, spending time outdoors, building memories that felt stable and secure. Jim worked as a computer programmer. It was a steady, reliable career. One that suited his personality: structured, logical, consistent. Sandra, on the other hand, ran a medical billing and coding business. She was driven in her own way, managing her work while also dealing with challenges that most people couldn't see from the outside. Because beneath the surface of their quiet life, there was struggle. Sandra suffered from multiple serious health conditions. According to reports, she had lupus, epilepsy, and hypothyroidism. These weren't minor issues. They were conditions that shaped daily life, unpredictable, exhausting, and sometimes frightening. Liz had witnessed her mother's seizures more than once, violent episodes that came without warning, moments that could turn an ordinary day into something terrifying in seconds. It affected all of them. And Jim carried much of that weight. He wasn't just a husband. He became a caretaker in many ways. He spent time researching her conditions, looking for treatments, trying to understand what doctors sometimes couldn't fully explain. There were times Sandra didn't feel safe driving, afraid a seizure might happen at the wrong moment. So Jim stepped in, quietly, consistently, and this was their life. Not glamorous, not dramatic, but real. And yet, despite the challenges, there were still moments of joy. The family loved to travel. They enjoyed hiking and fishing, being outdoors, away from the routine of everyday life. Those moments became more difficult over time as Sandra's health declined, but they were still part of who they were. By December 2012, Jim was approaching a milestone he had been working toward for years: retirement. He was just 5 months away. For many people, retirement represents uncertainty, but for Jim, it represented possibility, time, freedom, the chance to finally slow down and focus on the life he and Sandra had built together. According to accounts, he was already thinking about what that future might look like, what they could do, where they could go, how they would spend those years. So there was talk about selling their home, about traveling, about change, but not the kind of change anyone fears, the kind you plan for, the kind you look forward to. On December 22nd, 2012, Jim and Sandra decided to celebrate. Not just because Christmas was only days away, but because they had recently marked their 32nd wedding anniversary. It was meant to be a simple night. They went out to dinner at a restaurant they loved. Something familiar, something comfortable. There was nothing unusual about it. No signs of tension that anyone could clearly point to. No outward indication that anything was wrong. To anyone looking in, they were just another couple enjoying a quiet evening together. After dinner, they stopped at a CVS. A small, forgettable detail. Jim picked up drink mixes. It was around 9:30 p.m. when they returned home. Inside that house on Kelsey Meadows Court, everything appeared normal. The same walls, the same furniture, the same life they had been living for decades. They made drinks, they prepared snacks. And then they went into the bathroom, where they had a jacuzzi. It was the kind of space designed for relaxation, for slowing down, for conversation, and they talked about their future, about what they wanted the next chapter of their lives to look like. Jim was close to retirement, and it was clear he was thinking ahead, planning, imagining. They also talked about the next day. Family was coming over, a small gathering, nothing extravagant. Just time spent together before the holidays. It was, in every sense, an ordinary night until something shifted. At some point, the couple's dog started barking. It wasn't unusual for them to make noise. Dogs bark for all kinds of reasons. A sound outside, a passing car, something they don't recognize. But this time, Jim decided to get up and check on them. He left the bathroom. Sandra stayed behind. Minutes passed. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. 15. He didn't come back. The barking, according to later accounts, seemed to quiet down. So Sandra eventually got out of the jacuzzi herself. Maybe she assumed everything was fine. Maybe she thought Jim had just gotten distracted. She began getting ready for bed. She walked toward the closet next to the bathroom. And somewhere between that moment, between stepping out of the warmth of the water and into the quiet of the bedroom, something happened inside that house. Something no one would ever fully agree on. Because by the next day, December 23rd, the life Jim had built would no longer exist in the way he knew it. And the truth of what really happened that night would begin to fracture into two completely different versions of reality. And only one of them could be true. Before she was ever accused of murder, before detectives questioned her story, before a courtroom would divide over her guilt or innocence, Sandra Melgar was simply known as Jim's wife. A woman whose life, from the outside, appeared defined by resilience, faith, and survival. Sandra had spent much of her adult life managing pain, Not emotional pain alone, but physical pain that shaped nearly every part of her daily routine. According to reports and testimony, she lived with multiple chronic conditions, including lupus, epilepsy, and hypothyroidism. These were not minor inconveniences. They were serious, long-term illnesses that affected her energy, her independence, and at times, her ability to function without assistance. People close to her described periods where her health would decline sharply. Seizures, in particular, were a constant threat. They came without warning and could leave her disoriented, exhausted, and physically drained. There were moments when even basic tasks, driving, leaving the house alone, became sources of anxiety. In many ways, Sandra's life was defined by limitation. And within those limitations, Jim became her support system. He wasn't just her husband, he was her caretaker, her researcher, the person who tried to fill in the gaps when her body failed her. Their relationship, shaped over decades, had evolved into something deeply interdependent. For some couples, that kind of dynamic strengthens a bond. For others, it creates quiet pressures that build over time. But from the outside, there was no clear sign of fracture. Friends and family described their marriage as stable, long-standing, built on shared faith and routine. They were known to be devout Jehovah's Witnesses, a belief system that often emphasizes commitment, structure, and traditional views on marriage. Divorce within that context can carry significant emotional and social consequences, and that detail, their faith, would later become part of the narrative presented in court. Because when investigators began trying to understand what could have led to Jim's death, they didn't just look at physical evidence, they looked at motive. Prosecutors would later suggest two possible reasons why Sandra might have wanted Jim dead. The first was the idea of divorce. According to the prosecution, Sandra may have wanted to leave the marriage, but felt constrained by her religious beliefs, that pursuing a separation could isolate her from her community or disrupt the life she had built over decades. However, it's important to note that family members and those close to her have publicly disputed this claim, stating there was no indication she wanted to end the marriage. The second proposed motive was financial. Jim had a life insurance policy reportedly valued at around $250,000. In the event of his death, Sandra would have been the beneficiary. Prosecutors argued that this could have provided a financial incentive. But again, this was a theory, not a universally accepted fact. Because even as these narratives were introduced, there remained a fundamental problem with the case. There was no clear, undeniable motive that everyone agreed on, and that ambiguity would become one of the most debated aspects of the entire investigation. But to understand why Sandra became the focus of suspicion, it's necessary to look beyond motive and into the details of her behavior, her story, and the inconsistencies that investigators believed they saw. In the immediate aftermath of Jim's death, Sandra told authorities that she had no memory of what had happened during the critical hours of the night. According to her account, after getting out of the jacuzzi, she went to the closet to get ready for bed. And then, nothing. She said she either blacked out or suffered a seizure. When she regained consciousness, she claimed she was bound, disoriented, and unaware that hours had passed. She insisted she had no idea who had entered the house. No memory of any struggle, no knowledge of how Jim had been killed. From her perspective, she was not just a witness, she was a victim. But for investigators, that explanation raised immediate questions, because the crime scene they encountered was not subtle. Jim had sustained dozens of injuries, including multiple stab wounds and blunt force trauma. According to medical findings presented later, he had extensive defensive wounds on his hands and arms, indicating that he fought back against his attacker. This was not a silent event. It was violent, prolonged, chaotic. And yet Sandra claimed she heard nothing. No shouting, no sounds of struggle, no indication that anything was happening just feet away from her. To detectives, that didn't align. Then there were the physical details. Sandra had been found bound in a closet, her arms and legs tied. But according to investigators, there were limited signs of struggle on her body, few injuries, minimal abrasions. Nothing that clearly matched the level of force that might be expected if someone had been restrained against their will for an extended period of time. There were also questions about the bindings themselves. Whether they had been applied in a way that suggested outside involvement or something else. And then there was the scene inside the house. At first glance, it appeared as though the home had been ransacked, drawers opened, items moved, personal belongings out of place. It looked like a burglary. But as investigators examined the details more closely, some began to believe that the disorder felt controlled, not chaotic, not rushed, as if it had been arranged. There were no clear signs of forced entry. Doors were locked, windows intact, no obvious point of access, which raised a critical question. If someone had entered the home, how had they gotten in? And if they hadn't, then who was already inside? Investigators also noted that the weapon used in the attack, a kitchen knife, had come from inside the home. It hadn't been brought in from the outside. It was something already present, something familiar. Another detail that stood out was Jim's firearm. It was found loaded nearby and unused. If an unknown intruder had entered the home and attacked him, why hadn't Jim used it? Or at least attempted to? Some experts later suggested that if the attacker had been someone he knew, someone he didn't immediately perceive as a threat, it could explain why the weapon remained untouched. And slowly, piece by piece, the narrative investigators were forming began to shift, away from an unknown intruder, towards someone much closer. But there were still complications. DNA evidence recovered from parts of the house reportedly included profiles that did not match Jim or Sandra. Some of these findings were incomplete or not fully identified, leaving open the possibility, at least in theory, that someone else had been present. There was also a reported tip about a man seen behaving suspiciously in the neighborhood that night. A convicted thief named Chad Sullivan was mentioned, though according to available reports, he was never fully questioned in connection with the crime. Details like these introduced doubt, alternative possibilities, and for some observers, they raised a troubling question. Was the investigation focusing too narrowly? Or was the simplest explanation the correct one? As the days passed, Sandra remained consistent in her story. She denied any involvement in Jim's death. She maintained that she had blacked out, that she had been attacked, that she was as much a victim of that night as he was. But investigators were not convinced. Interviews became more pointed, questions more direct. At one stage, she was asked to take a polygraph test. She declined, citing her physical condition, saying she was shaking, cold, and not in a state to go through such a procedure. For detectives, that decision added to their suspicion. Not proof, but another piece in a growing puzzle. Because in their view, the story didn't make sense. And when a story doesn't make sense in a case like this, investigators don't just move on. They dig deeper. Over the next months, and then years, they would continue building a case. One that relied heavily on interpretation, on reconstruction, on the belief that what had been presented as a home invasion was something else entirely. And by the time that case was ready to move forward, Sandra Melgar would no longer be seen as a survivor of a violent attack. She would be seen as the person responsible for it. But what exactly happened inside that house that night, and whether the truth was as clear as investigators believed, would become the central question that defined everything that followed. Because the deeper you look into that night, the more it begins to feel like two completely different stories are fighting to exist at the same time. And the line between them is where the truth is supposed to be. On the night of December 22nd, 2012, everything in Jim's life appeared calm, quiet, even ordinary. Yet somewhere between midnight and morning, something unfolded inside that house that would leave behind more questions than answers. It had been a meaningful day for Jim Melgar and his wife, Sandra Melgar. The couple had just celebrated their 32nd wedding anniversary. According to reports and Sandra's own statements to investigators, they went out for dinner that evening at a favorite Mexican restaurant. It was simple, familiar. Exactly the kind of evening they had shared for decades. On their way home, they stopped at a CVS store to pick up drink mixers. Nothing about the stop stood out at the time, although Sandra would later tell police that she believed a car might have been following them. Investigators would note this claim, but never confirm it. By the time they returned to their home on Kelsey Meadows Court in northwest Harris County, it was around 9:30 p.m. Inside, they settled into what seemed like a routine night. According to Sandra, they prepared drinks and snacks, then spent time together in the jacuzzi located in their master bathroom. It was a moment of calm, a couple talking about the future, about retirement, about travel. Jim was only months away from leaving his job as a computer programmer. Life, by all appearances, was entering a quieter, hopeful phase. At some point during the night, the couple's dogs began barking. Sandra told investigators that Jim got out of the jacuzzi to deal with the noise. He had done it many times before, calling the dogs inside or settling them down. Nothing unusual. But this time, he didn't come back. Minutes passed, then more time. According to Sandra, she eventually got out of the jacuzzi herself and walked toward the closet connected to the bathroom, preparing to change and go to bed. That, she said, is where her memory ends. She later told detectives that she believed she may have blacked out, possibly from a seizure, a condition she had a documented history of. She described waking up hours later, disoriented, in pain, and bound inside a closet. But what happened in that gap, those missing hours, became the center of a case that would divide investigators, attorneys, and the public for years. The discovery. The next morning, December 23rd, something was already wrong. A neighbor noticed that the Melgar's garage door was open early in the day. It stayed open for hours, something neighbors described as unusual. No one was seen entering or leaving the house. Then by the afternoon, Jim's family arrived for a planned gathering. It was meant to be a celebration, an anniversary dinner just days before Christmas. But when they got there, no one answered the door. Jim's brother, Herman Melgar, eventually entered the home through the garage. Inside, the house felt off, quiet, still. According to later accounts, the blinds were closed, the air heavy, and there was an unsettling silence. Then came the sound that changed everything, a faint, muffled voice. Herman followed it upstairs into the master bedroom, then into the bathroom, and finally to a small walk-in closet. The closet door was blocked from the outside by a chair. When he moved it and opened the door, he found Sandra. She was lying on the floor, bound at her wrists and ankles with scarves. And Herman struggled to untie her before running to get scissors. Moments later, as he searched further through the home, he found Jim in another closet, approximately 30 feet away. What he saw would later be described in court as a brutal and violent scene. What happened to Jim was found naked, with severe injuries across his body. According to the Harris County Medical Examiner, he had suffered more than 50 injuries, including 31 stab wounds. There were also blunt force injuries to his head, suggesting he had been struck. Perhaps most telling were the defensive wounds, cuts and injuries on his hands and arms. indicating that Jim had fought back. He had tried to defend himself. Investigators believed this was not a quick attack. It was prolonged, violent, and intensely personal. Despite the severity of the injuries, and there were details that complicated the scene. Jim's legs were tied with a telephone cord, and a rope was loosely wrapped around his chest. However, investigators would later suggest that these bindings may have been applied after his death, not before, raising questions about staging. A kitchen knife, later identified as the murder weapon, was found inside the jacuzzi. It had come from inside the Melgar's own home. Jim's firearm was also discovered nearby, loaded but unused. For investigators, that detail stood out. Sandra's condition. When authorities arrived, Sandra was still alive. She told paramedics and police that she had no memory of the attack. She said the last thing she remembered was being in the bathroom preparing for bed. After that, nothing. She described waking up tied in the closet, in pain, and believing she had suffered a seizure. However, investigators quickly noticed inconsistencies. Despite being bound for what could have been hours, Sandra had minimal injuries. There were no significant cuts, no major bruising, and no ligature marks consistent with prolonged restraint. Given the violent nature of Jim's death, detectives questioned how she could have remained largely unharmed. The crime scene. As investigators processed the home, more questions emerged. Drawers had been opened, jewelry boxes appeared disturbed, a purse and wallet were out in the bedroom. At first glance, it looked like a robbery, but something didn't fit. There were no clear signs of forced entry. Doors were locked, windows were intact. Items that were reportedly missing, such as prescription medications and possibly electronics, as were not consistently documented in official reports. Some drawers appeared too neatly opened, more like they had been staged than ransacked in a hurry. Blood evidence was also unusual. Aside from Jim's blood, there was little to suggest the presence of another injured person. For such a violent attack, the absence of additional blood traces raised further doubts. DNA testing would later reveal unknown male and female profiles on certain items, but these were never conclusively identified. A community in shock news of the crime spread quickly through the quiet Houston neighborhood. A couple, married for over 3 decades, a home that appeared safe, a crime scene that made no sense. Neighbors described fear and confusion. Many couldn't believe that something so violent could happen without anyone hearing anything. No screams, no struggle, and no clear disturbance. Even investigators were divided in the early stages. Was this a home invasion gone wrong? Or something far more complex? The first turning point. Within hours of the discovery, attention began to shift. Not outward, but inward. Toward the only surviving witness. Toward Sandra. Detectives noted the inconsistencies in her story, the lack of injuries, and the unusual nature of the crime scene. While they did not immediately charge her, suspicion began to build. And as the investigation moved forward, one question became impossible to ignore. If someone had entered that house to kill Jim, why was Sandra still alive? That question would shape everything that came next, and it would lead investigators down a path that would ultimately divide a courtroom, a family, and an entire community. In the hours after Jim was found, the investigation didn't just begin, it narrowed. Not toward an unknown intruder, but toward someone already inside the house. From the very beginning, detectives with the Harris County Sheriff's Office were faced with a scene that didn't behave the way violent home invasions usually do. There was no forced entry, no shattered windows, no broken locks. And despite the brutality of what happened to Jim Melgar, there were no signs of chaos spreading throughout the home. Instead, there was something else: stillness, control, and details that to trained investigators began to feel staged. The first interviews within hours, Sandra Melgar was brought in for questioning. She appeared shaken, cold, disoriented. She told detectives the same story she would repeat for years. She and Jim had been in the jacuzzi. The dogs started barking. Jim left to check on them. She went to the closet to get dressed, and then she blacked out. When she woke up, she said she was tied up, alone, in pain, confused. She insisted she heard nothing, no struggle, no screams. For investigators, that claim was difficult to accept because the medical evidence told a different story. Jim had fought for his life. With more than 50 injuries, many of them defensive, experts believed the attack would have taken time. It would have been loud, violent, chaotic. And yet, Sandra said she heard nothing, a scene that didn't add up. As forensic teams continued analyzing the house, more inconsistencies began to surface. The drawers in the bedroom had been opened, but not in the hurried, chaotic way typical of a burglary. Items were laid out, not scattered. In Rastis, a candle near Jim's bed was still burning, something prosecutors would later argue suggested there had been no violent struggle in that immediate area. The murder weapon, a kitchen knife, came from inside the home. Jim's gun was nearby, loaded, unused. And then there were the bindings. Investigators noted that the ropes and cords used on Jim appeared loose, too loose to restrain someone during a violent struggle. Experts would later testify that it was possible these had been applied after death. Sandra's restraints raised even more questions. Despite being tied up for what she claimed was many hours, she showed no significant ligature marks, something detectives expected to see if someone had been bound tightly for that long. To investigators, the picture forming was not one of an interrupted robbery. It was something far more controlled. And the missing motive. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. There was still a problem, a major one: motive. Why would Sandra kill Jim? By all outward appearances, their marriage had been stable. Friends and family described them as close, devoted even. There were no public records of domestic violence, no documented history of serious conflict. But prosecutors would later present two possible motives. The first, divorce. According to the prosecution, Sandra may have wanted to leave the marriage, but as a Jehovah's Witness, divorce carried serious social consequences. It could mean isolation from her religious community. The second, money. Jim had a life insurance policy worth approximately $250,000, with Sandra as the beneficiary. The prosecution argued that financial gain, combined with personal pressures, could have created motive. But the defense strongly pushed back. They argued there was no direct evidence that Sandra wanted a divorce, no documented statements, no preparations, no action suggesting she was planning to leave. And the insurance policy? They said it was standard, something many couples have, not evidence of intent. To them, motive remained unproven. The DNA puzzle. Then came one of the most puzzling elements of the case. DNA investigators found unknown male and female DNA profiles on various items in the home: door handles, dresser drawers, even the scarves used to bind Sandra. These profiles did not match anyone in the Melgar family. For the defense, this was critical. They argued it supported the theory of intruders, unknown individuals who had entered the home, committed the crime, and left. But prosecutors countered that the DNA was inconclusive. It was not tied to any known suspects, and it could have been transferred innocently over time. No fingerprints, no surveillance footage, no eyewitnesses, just fragments and interpretations. The investigation narrows. In December 2012, just days after the crime, detectives believed they had enough to charge Sandra. They contacted the Harris County District Attorney's Office. But the answer came back: not yet. There wasn't enough evidence. So the case didn't end. It stretched on for months, then years. During that time, investigators continued building their case, re-examining evidence, consulting experts, and refining their theory. Sandra, meanwhile, remained free, but under suspicion, the arrest. Nearly 2 years later, in the summer of 2014, everything changed. A grand jury indicted Sandra Melgar on a charge of first-degree murder, and the arrest shocked many. Neighbors who had once feared a random intruder now faced a different possibility: that the crime had come from within the home all along. Sandra maintained her innocence. She insisted the police had misunderstood the evidence, that they had built a theory first, then tried to make the facts fit. Her defense team argued that the case was entirely circumstantial. No confession, no eyewitness, no direct physical evidence linking her to the attack, the trial. In August 2017, the case went to trial. Inside the courtroom, two completely different versions of reality were presented. The prosecution painted a picture of a calculated act. They argued that Sandra attacked Jim, possibly by surprise, then staged the scene to look like a home invasion. They suggested she may have cleaned herself afterward, explaining the lack of blood evidence. They pointed to the inconsistencies in her story, the lack of injuries, and the forensic details that didn't align with an outside attacker. The defense told a different story. They argued that the investigation had been flawed from the start, that detectives had ignored evidence pointing to intruders, especially the unidentified DNA. They emphasized Sandra's physical condition, arguing she would not have had the strength to overpower Jim, who had clearly fought back. They also pointed out that she had no blood on her, no cuts, no broken nails, nothing to suggest she had committed such a violent act. For days, the jury listened. They saw photos, heard expert testimony, watched interrogation footage, and wrestled with a case that had no clear, undeniable answer. The verdict. After deliberating for 2 days, the jury reached a decision: guilty. Sandra Melgar was convicted of the murder of her husband. She was sentenced to 27 years in prison. In the courtroom, reactions were immediate: shock, tears. According to reports, even some who had followed the case closely were surprised by the outcome. Jim's daughter, Elizabeth, publicly stated that she did not believe her mother was guilty. She maintained that someone else had committed the crime and that the real perpetrator had never been found. Aftermath and appeals. Sandra's legal team quickly filed appeals, arguing that the evidence was insufficient to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Those appeals were denied, but the case didn't fade. In later years, organizations like the Innocence Project of Texas took interest, reviewing the case and raising concerns about the conviction. They argued that unanswered questions remained, particularly around the DNA evidence and the lack of definitive proof. To this day, the case remains deeply divisive. Some believe justice was served. Others believe a mistake was made. A case without closure. For the Melgar family, closure has never truly come, because even after a conviction, the central question still lingers. Not just in courtrooms, not just in legal documents, but in the minds of everyone who has ever looked at the evidence and wondered, what really happened inside that house? And is the truth still missing? Long after the courtroom emptied, long after the verdict was read, the story of Jim Melgar did not end. Because for the people who loved him, time did not move forward the same way. It fractured. It slowed. And in many ways, it stood still. A life remembered. Before anything else, before theories, before arguments, before courtrooms, there was Jim. A husband, a father, a man who, according to those who knew him, had a quiet warmth about him. Someone who made bad jokes just to make people smile. Someone who preferred a simple life over a loud one. Jim had spent most of his life in Houston after immigrating from Guatemala as a child. He built a stable career as a computer programmer, working steadily for years, preparing for a retirement he was only months away from reaching. He wasn't chasing fame. He wasn't living recklessly. He was building something steady, something lasting. With Sandra, his wife of over 3 decades, he shared routines that many people take for granted. Dinners, conversations, quiet nights at home. And they traveled when they could. They spent time outdoors. They built a life that to outsiders looked grounded and real. And to their daughter, Elizabeth, Liz, they were more than parents. They were best friends. After Jim's death, Liz would find herself caught in something no child should ever have to face. A reality where justice for her father seemed tied to the destruction of her mother. A family divided by a verdict. When Sandra Melgar was convicted in 2017, it did not bring closure. It created a divide. On one side, the prosecution, the jury, and those who believed the evidence pointed clearly to Sandra. On the other, family members, supporters, and advocates who believed something had gone wrong, that the investigation had focused too narrowly, too quickly, and had overlooked critical possibilities. Liz publicly stood by her mother. She stated that she did not believe Sandra was responsible for Jim's death. According to interviews and reports, she has continued to push for answers, believing that the real truth has not yet been uncovered. For her, grief became complicated, because mourning her father meant confronting a system that said her mother was the reason he was gone, and she didn't believe it. The ongoing fight years after the conviction, the case continued to draw attention. Legal teams filed appeals, arguing that the evidence used to convict Sandra was insufficient. They pointed to the lack of direct physical evidence, the unidentified DNA found at the scene, and the absence of a clear, provable motive. Those appeals were denied, but the case didn't disappear. Organizations like the Innocence Project of Texas began reviewing the case, raising concerns about potential wrongful conviction. They highlighted the same issues the defense had argued during trial. No eyewitnesses, no confession. No definitive forensic link placing Sandra as the attacker, unidentified DNA that was never fully resolved. For them, the case represented something larger than one verdict. It became part of a broader conversation about how circumstantial evidence is interpreted and how certainty is constructed inside a courtroom. Where Sandra is today. As of recent reports, Sandra remains incarcerated in Texas. She has continued to maintain her innocence. In interviews conducted from prison, she has repeated the same core statement she gave from the very beginning: she did not kill her husband. She has expressed regret, not for the crime she was convicted of, but for the fact that she cannot remember what happened that night. She has said that the memory gap still haunts her, leaving her unable to provide the answers that might change everything. If she is granted parole, she could be released in the early 2030s. If not, she may remain in prison into her 80s. A community still asking questions. For the neighborhood where the Melgars once lived, the case never fully settled. At first, there was fear of a possible intruder, someone who could enter a home unnoticed and leave devastation behind. Then came confusion, when attention shifted toward Sandra. And finally, uncertainty. Because even with a conviction, the case did not answer every question. There were no surveillance images showing someone entering or leaving. No clear timeline of events inside the house. No definitive explanation for the unknown DNA. No consensus. Just a story with two competing versions, both incomplete in their own way. What this case reveals. Cases like this don't just test evidence, they test belief. They force people to confront uncomfortable truths about how justice works and how it sometimes doesn't feel absolute. The legal system is built on the idea of proof, beyond a reasonable doubt. But what happens when doubt still exists, even after a verdict? What happens when evidence can be interpreted in more than one way? And what happens when the truth, whatever it may be, remains just out of reach? The story of Jim Melgar is not just about a crime. It's about uncertainty, about how quickly a life can be taken and how slowly answers can come. Remembering Jim. In all of this, in the arguments, the appeals, the debates, it's easy to lose sight of the person at the center of it all. Jim. A man who woke up on December the 22nd, 2012, expecting nothing more than a quiet evening with his wife. A man who had plans, retirement, travel, time. A man who fought in his final moments for his life. And a man whose story, even now, is still being told in fragments. His family continues to live with the weight of that night, not just the loss, but the questions. Because closure doesn't come from a verdict alone. It comes from understanding. And in this case, understanding remains incomplete. Final reflection. Some believe justice was served. Others believe a mistake was made. And between those two beliefs lies a truth that may never be fully known. But one thing is certain. A life was lost. A family was changed forever. And a story that began with love ended in something no one could have predicted. His name was Jim Melgar. He deserved more time. The world is quieter without him in it.